عليك بالعيال يا بابا.
ادهم لله، والاله مات والرب مات، وحدوه. جايين الرب رايحين يدفنوا الرب الله يرحمه.
شفتني وانا مالي.
The idea of Jesus' agony on the cross is so ingrained in the human psyche that it's difficult to imagine a Christianity without it. But unlike the account of the crucifixion in the canonical Gospels, in the Gospel of Peter, the story of Jesus' ordeal on the cross is one completely devoid of suffering. The text claims that as he was being crucified, he was silent, having no pain. The account also carefully avoids saying that Jesus died. This failure to undergo fundamental human experiences such as pain, suffering and death would have rung alarm bells for many in the early church. Were the supporters of the Gospel of Peter suggesting that Jesus wasn't human? Although Christians today take for granted the idea that Jesus was both man and God, the Gospel of Peter very clearly shows that for the first Christians, this was still a matter of debate. This was a church in confusion, where ideas about the balance between Jesus' humanity and divinity were hotly contested. Was he divine? Was he merely human? Or was he somewhere in between?
الكلام ده فين؟ في العصور الأولى. هم الوقت بيقول لك يسوع إله. إن أقرب ناس إلى المسيح كانوا في جدال في الموضوع ده. أنت لا ده هو إله كامل وإنسان كامل. الدليل إيه؟ شنودة بيقول كده.
The people who upheld the Gospel of Peter were at the heart of this conflict. For them, Jesus was purely divine. He only appeared to be human, and his suffering and death were a deception. I can understand their thinking. If Jesus was God, surely he couldn't have suffered. After all, God can't die. After all, God can't die. After all, God can't die. This school of thought came to be called Docetism, a name derived from the Greek word dokesis, which means appearance or semblance. And those who were part of the sect were called the Docetai, literally illusionists, those who believed Jesus' humanity wasn't real. We don't know who wrote the Gospel of Peter, but it certainly wasn't the only tract about the nature of Jesus circulating in the early church. There were other texts promoting alternative ideas. If the Docetic views of Jesus lay at one extreme, then there was another equally controversial group whose views lay at the other. Whilst the Docetists claimed Jesus only appeared to be mortal, this sect believed he was most definitely a human, but one hijacked by God.
أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
Here in Israel, traces of another lost gospel can be found. It's a text which shockingly suggests that Jesus, although singled out by God, was born a mere mortal. It was the work of a sect now virtually forgotten, known as the Ebionites. They were Christians, but they were strongly committed to maintaining the Jewishness of their faith. They believed Jesus was the Jewish Messiah sent by God to fulfill Jewish scripture.
شوف يا اخو في القرن الاول كانوا يؤمنون ان يسوع رسول انسان فقط. في القرن الاول يعني مش الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم بعد 600 سنه، في القرن الاول.
Although this sect were by no means the only Jewish Christians at the time, after all Jesus had been a Jew, as had all his earliest followers, the Ebionites provoked some of the most vociferous opposition.
يعني ايه مجموعات يهوديه مسيحيه؟ تعرفوا يعني ايه؟ اقول لك يعني الناس هذه لا يطلق عليهم مسيحيين، هم يهود ولكن كانوا يؤمنوا ان عيسى ابن مريم عليه السلام هو المسيح الموعود الذي ارسله الله سبحانه وتعالى. فهمت يا اخوه الكرام؟ ما يعني هم يهود وما كانوا بيتوقعوا نفسهم مسيحيين، وكانوا بيقوموا بالعادات اليهوديه كلها، ولكن يؤمنوا ان المسيح صلى الله عليه وسلم هو رسول الله وهو المسيح المنتظر. هو ده الفرق بس، سامعين؟ هو ده الفرق الوحيد. يعني اليهود لم يرفضوا، قبلوا المسيح على انه قبلوا عيسى ابن مريم على انه المسيح، وكان ماسك جديد خالص، يعني العبادات اليهوديه، الصلوات اليهوديه، التوراه وكل شيء. انما بولس هو اللي عمل الدين الجديد المسيحي.
Their name comes from the Hebrew word ebion, meaning poor. It was a term their opponents used to their advantage, accusing them not of being poor in material wealth, but in understanding. Unlike other Christian groups such as the Gnostics and the Docetics, although the Ebionites must have written their own Gospels and treatises, none of them have actually survived. In fact, the only reason we know about them at all is because their heresies have been immortalized in the works of their opponents.
أي حد يؤمن إن يسوع إنسان كانوا بيقولوا عليه مهرطق.
Glimpses of the gospel have surfaced in the writings of an early Christian named Epiphanius. One of his most lengthy texts is known as the Panarion, and in it he attacks no fewer than 80 heretical groups and their books. Professor Larry Hurtado has studied it. What does Epiphanius say in the Panarium about the Ebionites?
He doesn't like them. He lists them as one of a whole menagerie of various Christian groups that he regards as heretics. It's a kind of handbook of every kind of Christian belief you never want to embrace, among which he lists the Ebionites as one of them. Basic things that he says is that he describes them as a kind of Jewish Christian group, and he says that they prefer their own gospel over against the four gospels that are recognized by other Christians.
يعني كان لهم انجيل وده في القرن الاول الميلادي. شوف ده عدد الاناجيل، كل مجموعه مسيحيه كان لها انجيل. تخيلوا كان في كام انجيل موجود في ذلك الوقت. ولذلك بيقولوا ايه في مؤتمر نقيا 325 ميلاديه كان موجود اكثر من 200 انجيل.
And what was this gospel?
One writer describes it as being a version of the Gospel of Matthew in Hebraic language with certain things missing, but it raises about as many questions as it does settle.
But if the gospel of the Ebionites was based on a work that was accepted into the New Testament, why on earth was it considered heretical? Well, if we study the accusations of their opponents, there's one shocking difference between the two texts. In Matthew's Gospel, Jesus is said to have been miraculously born of a virgin. But the Ebionites disagreed. So in their Gospel, left the story of the Nativity.
لاحظوا شيء مهم جدا جدا. بولس لم يتكلم على الميلاد العذري يسوع. هل معنى هذا ان بولس كان يؤمن ان يسوع ابن